We are back, and we have a special guest.
Yes.
We have Mr. Megadan 2969, Mr. Porno himself. So the last time we were all together, we were talking about porn and a bunch of other things. But
like
really, we honed
And
in
we're going to get
on,
back to that.
Oh, we will, yeah.
Yeah. We honed in, though, on the NES, and it's getting a little bit of flack these days on the interwebs, and people saying stuff like the TurboGrafx 16 dominates it, the Master System dominates it, the Game Boy's better. And we're like, hang on.
Pause.
The NES is amazing, and there's more than 20 games, which we've seen people say. But that video, which did pretty well, there was a lot of comments of people saying, the Super Nintendo is so much better than the NES. And I will say, I'm a Super Nintendo guy. I think all three of us are. The Super Nintendo is great. But Dan, in the background, was talking to me, and he's like, but not so fast, though, guys. Not so fast. Is it really that obvious that the Super Nintendo just dunks on the NES?
Well, first off, it's called Super Nintendo. So automatically it wins, right?
Now you're playing with power. Super Fight.
It takes the Nintendo and makes it super.
And none of us hate the Super Nintendo. It's not like that. But Dan, I'll let you take it from here because you have some really good points about this topic.
To further elaborate on this, what I was coming up with, don't get me wrong, I don't want people to take this like Super Nintendo is not as good as the NES. I mean, that's subjective. But it's fair to say Super Nintendo is the Super Nintendo, right? It's supposed to be Nintendo and everything above that, right? But my thing was, when you're actually comparing one-for-ones with each thing, it's like, we looked at the Double Dragons, and I know there's a fighting game on there or whatever. We're going to kind of exclude that, unless that's something you're into, awesome. But we're talking about like the normal Double Dragon game. There's Super Double Dragon, but just remember that the NES had Double Dragon 1, 2, and 3.
Yeah.
So it's like, when you're speaking about certain games, the NES actually, in my opinion, wins in that category. And we were talking about even stuff like, now this is a tougher one, Castlevania.
Oh, yeah.
So, you have Super Castlevania, and then you have Dracula X, but then you have Castlevania 1, 2, and 3 on the NES. And I'm not saying that the NES's ones are better and you'd rather take those over the Super Nintendo one, but I'm saying it's not that easy of a decision, though.
No, it's not. When you start boiling down, well, you could look at any franchise. Like, let's just say the first thing that comes to your mind when you talk Nintendo, Mario. Mm-hmm. The NES, you got freaking Mario, Mario 2, Mario 3. Fantastic. Super Nintendo comes along, and then you get arguably one of the best Mario games ever made, Super Mario World.
Sure.
But that's just one game.
And you could say the same thing about Mario 3 as well.
Yeah, Mario 3 is also arguably one of the, but it's like, you got one Mario game, there is like, like the lost levels and all this stuff, but you got one Mario game versus 3 Mario games. Sure. So then it starts getting tough, and you could look at even like Mega Man. You got freaking, what is it, 6 Mega Mans on the NES? Yep. And then on Super Nintendo, you got X. 1 or 2 X. They started, so it's like,
and you have 7. Yeah.
Some of the games might be better, but it's like you got more of them.
Yeah.
And don't get me wrong, most people would say Mega Man X is better. But what I'm saying is, the classic ones are super good too.
They're so good. Yeah.
So I feel like people take Super Nintendo and they easily put it above the NES, and it's like, is it though? Because there's another one. It's like Super Punch-Out, Mike Tyson's Punch-Out.
Yes, 2 boxing games that are great.
I think most people say Mike Tyson's Punch-Out.
And that's coming from Super Punch-Out is badass.
That's my favorite Super Nintendo game.
Yeah, it's your favorite Super Nintendo game of all time, and you still put it above it.
I mean, the point that we're getting at can be told time and time again. A lot of people say Link to the Past is the best Zelda game.
Mm-hmm.
But you have Zelda, and then you've got Zelda 2 on the NES. So if you could only pick one,
what do you go with?
And that's a tough. I don't even know the answer. I mean,
exactly.
Personally, I'd probably, like, thinking about it this way, I'd probably lean towards the NES. There's just so much more.
Yeah.
Not saying that the Super Nintendo version of those games isn't the cream of the crop.
Right.
It's the super version.
But there's so much more of a crop.
It's like audience here, I'm holding the door shut. Just calm down.
Yeah.
we know Super Nintendo is awesome.
Yeah, so it's kind of just a discussion. I think the comments should get wild. Like, what if you're comparing NES and Super Nintendo, what is the king? And it's hard to pick, but I think a lot of people automatically assume, because everybody on YouTube says Super Nintendo, greatest console of all time, which, I mean, it's great. I love it. But when you start really digging into the NES Super Nintendo,
it's
which one is it? And
it's closer than it should be.
It's closer than it should be, but and people don't acknowledge that it's that close. One thing that I want to bring up too is, on the NES, you got Contra, you got Super C, 2 amazing Contra entries. But then on the Super Nintendo, you got Alien Wars,
and then you got Contra Force.
Well, yeah, but
technically counts.
Yes.
So it's 3-1 then. Alien Wars is a fantastic game, but I think out of just talking about Contra here, I'd rather play Contra and Super C than Alien Wars.
Yep.
But it's tough because Alien
And that's
Wars.
what I'm saying.
Yeah, it's so tough.
You know? And it's like there's another one too. You have stuff like Gradius 3, but then on the NES, dude, you've got Gradius 1 if you count Famicom, Gradius 2, and then you got Life Force.
Yeah.
You take NES in that.
Yeah.
So NES wins in a lot of categories.
I think when you dive into games, I think it does win.
I'm gonna be the Super Nintendo advocate.
Yeah, I think we need both sides.
I'm gonna come in and say touche to a lot of the points we've talked about, but
yes,
the Donkey Kong countries.
Yeah.
And
that
then
is a huge thing.
And not to dunk on the NES, but the Super Nintendo in my mind is head and shoulders in the RPG world, which is probably not a genre that the three of us talk about a ton on our channels.
No, yeah. And everybody in the comments is like, you guys never talk about this. And it's like, well, we don't play those. So it's we don't feel like we have the right way to talk about them.
Sure.
But
don't get me wrong, I just, not to cut you off, Wes, I played Final Fantasy just recently, and I had such a great time with that on NES. But then I do see Final Fantasy 2 and 3 over on the Super Nintendo. Don't get me wrong, dude. They look freaking awesome. Yeah, and I'll be honest, I'm sure they're better. So I'm giving that to Super Nintendo.
Yeah.
But go ahead, Wes. I'm sorry about that.
No, I just think this whole thing is basically us getting together to say, not so fast.
Yeah.
Not so fast. It's not as obvious as what you think. You know, is Alien Wars better in an individual comparison to the Contra games on the NES? And possibly, but it's a fight.
It's a lot cooler. Yeah.
But it's a fight.
The sense of, it is. In the sense of being like cool graphically and stuff, I think I just love the classic Contra one.
And also graphically, people are gonna be like, well, the Super Nintendo looks better, and it's like, it's double the bits, dude.
Yeah.
What do you expect? Of course it is.
And I mean, don't get me wrong. Let's shout out to the Super Nintendo controller, which is like the best of all time.
Oh yeah, if you dive into controllers, the Super Nintendo controller is amazing. 4 buttons, shoulder buttons, and then you go to the NES and it's a freaking brick, and it's like, what is this?
Yeah,
you know. But game wise, and I think that's what all three of us really care about. Like, we don't care about hardware; we care about the software. We care about the games. And don't get me wrong,
there's another one I didn't before anybody's freaking out in the comments. Metroid 1 versus Super Metroid. It's not even close.
Yes.
Super Metroid. All day.
But
I mean, don't get me wrong.
You get into then even like what I would just call like movie licensed or franchises. And another one worth talking about is Batman.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, Batman Returns on Super Nintendo is dope. Don't get me wrong. It's an awesome beat 'em up. But then you got Batman Pornever, which it's garbage.
I have fun with it.
Yeah, I do too. I like the Sega Saturn one, but I digress. But then, man, you go to the NES and holy cow, you know, you got the Sunsoft Batman, you got the Batman Returns, which I think somebody just no death ran. So you can toot your own horn if you want.
There it is.
And the Return of the Joker. I mean, it's just really to say, like, guys, don't jump the gun. Like, don't forget how
we're not saying, for a lot of people that are freaking out in the video we're watching right now, we're not saying the NES is better per se.
Yeah,
we're just saying pause before you say Super Nintendo's the king of all. Maybe start looking. Like, what type of games do you like? Do you like sports games? Well, start comparing them.
It shouldn't be a knee-jerk answer. That's what the point of is.
I mean, talking sports real quick, you talk about there's a Tecmo Bowl on isn't there 2 Tecmo Bowls, West, on the Super Nintendo?
3.
There's 3.
The final edition,
But do you take Tecmo Bowl and Super Tecmo Bowl on the NES? I think you do. You know what I mean? Do you?
I probably...
Those are fun, but the Super ones are also, like, they're both
But they're
fun.
all 3 of them are the same build.
Yeah, they're all,
They're all, like, the exact same game for the most part. Where the NES has the variety, because Tecmo Bowl's very different than Super Tecmo Bowl.
Absolutely.
And when you play in the NES ones, you have a higher chance of guessing plays because there's less plays.
Yeah.
So
That's why you like
so
it.
when you're on defense, you have a better chance of maybe winning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's why I like it.
There was another one I'd bring up too. Is you have something iconic like Battletoads, and then you have ones that Battletoads Double Dragon is actually on both systems. And I'll be honest, I played them both and beat them both. I'm pretty sure, in my opinion, the NES one plays way better than the Super Nintendo one, which is like one where it's a 1-for-1, and the NES one's actually better.
See, that's wild. Because was that?
Yeah.
I'm guessing that was a later release for the NES and early.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I'm sure there's a couple more games that are like that where it got released for both. And
Well, I think when a lot of people think of the NES, they grew up in that time frame. They had moved on, and they do miss out or forget about all those late releases on
There's
the
a
NES
lot
that
of
are just pushing the hardware to the fucking maximum.
Power Blade.
You got your Power Blade 2s, and there were some games that they're the expensive ones, of course, because nobody was buying those, and so they're not ingrained in people's mind of like, oh man, the NES was still popping off bangers into 1993.
Yeah, which is insane. So
yeah, and the main reason I brought this talk up to Wes and yourself was it's not really that I'm saying that NES is better than Super Nintendo, but what I was trying to say is when you're saying stuff like Master System and all this other stuff's easily better than the NES or Game Boy's better than the NES, when you're saying that stuff, it's like, but do you think Super Nintendo's way better? Because NES is kind of there.
yeah, it is. Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's just, again, you gotta really dig in and understand that NES it's pretty freaking
It's the
good,
GOAT,
man.
dude. The NES is so good. It's just wild. I think a lot of people just make those comments and don't really think, or they just have, or you know what I mean? But that's the internet. You know, people don't think.
Sure.
But I think when you really dive deep, into like when people are saying the Master System's better than the NES, when you start going 1-to-1, it's just like, no, it's not. When you start going 1-to-1 with the Game Boy, it's like, no, it's not.
Yeah,
like, what are you talking about?
And my point is, too, like, say you're going to say Master System. Okay, does Master System come close to Super Nintendo? Because probably not. Right?
Probably not.
They don't even have a lot of the same games.
Yeah, so then it's like,
know?
so how is that better than the NES?
Exactly, but you're going to say that's better than NES, even though NES is coming so close to Super Nintendo.
Do you think the people that say the PS5 is better than the NES, not to go too far back into our other video, do you think people are saying the PS5 is better than Super Nintendo?
I mean, yeah, I guess. That's so... Guys, is it fair to say that's just so hard to compare because of how different stuff is?
Yes. Things are so
it's
different.
Like, it's like, that's just so hard. And to be honest, I'll be the first one to tell you, I'm not a good one to ask that question because as for new games, I do play new games, but I don't play a whole bunch of new games.
Yeah.
So when I'm speaking to you about NES or Super Nintendo, because I've beaten literally like 400 or 500 of them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I'm knowing from an experience. I'm not going to lie here and say that, I've beaten a bunch of new games and I totally understand all that stuff. To me, it's just, I don't know about you guys. To me, it's just hard to compare that.
It's weird. I look at it a lot like comparing different eras in sports.
Oh, yeah.
I don't like doing that either because, you know, when you're trying to compare a quarterback from an era where they'd throw 15 to 20 times a game tops to a completely different rule system that's in place and they're throwing the ball 35, 40 times a game, it's like we can't even compare the stats, let alone they're playing more games in a season now. And so you got to really understand the era that it was in and the power that it had within the era. That's like when people look at sales of stuff. Yeah. Well, it's outsold this. It's like, but you don't get the landscape of when the NES or Super Nintendo were out. It wasn't, the gaming wasn't this huge cultural bubble that it is now.
Yeah, people weren't streaming on Twitch and YouTube all the time. You know,
no, very good point. Yeah,
it makes you gotta walk it back a little bit. Like you can't just say, you know, I even use this argument all the time when people will when I'll be debating about movies and they'll say, well, this movie grossed this much at the box office. Okay, pause. The movie tickets are worth more now. Yep. Okay, so let's get that out of the way. And then you have to get me to believe that Avatar is better than Godfather.
There it is.
It's not. It's just not. It's
Even though financially it might have looked like
Yeah.
it is, it's just like, no, it's just because more people went out and saw it because it was a theater movie. If you compare it long term and big picture, it's the tough part is I mean, in this video we're comparing Super Nintendo and NES, but when you're comparing modern to retro, it's tough because you got 40 years on the NES and you got 6 on the PS5.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
like you can't compare them really.
One thing I wanted to say before we get too far here is that that's a great point there, guys, where you have to understand, again, I know I'm just this NES guy and people probably get super annoyed, but NES back then, to say it was in like, what was it, 1 of every 5 homes or something like that? When it
Damn.
came out. So that's not normal back then.
yeah.
And that should kind of speak to how it was, right?
Yeah, nobody
It
had
was
games.
this, right, where now when a new PS5 comes out, well, to your guys' point, everybody's gaming now.
Yeah.
So I'm not trying to say it doesn't matter or something like that, but it's a lot easier to hit those numbers when it's a cool thing now. Where
Yeah.
back then, NES was coming into the picture when gaming was kind of looked at as almost kind of a bad thing.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
like parents
You know?
back in the era, and obviously I wasn't born yet, but I've read stories and seen stuff.
Sure.
But parents back in the era when it released, they were like, "No, video games are bad. We don't want our children
Yeah.
just sitting in front of the television. We want them outside
Yeah.
playing." And so but nowadays, people that don't even like we're gamers, but people that aren't like us still have modern consoles. They use it for their entertainment. For their people could buy a PS5 and that's how they watch Netflix, you know.
Yeah.
And they I mean that's how
Facts.
that's how I use my
Yeah.
PS4 almost daily is to stream stuff. I mean I do play games on it, but it's like they're buying it not just for the video games.
Yep.
They're buying it for everything.
When are we gonna get porn on systems, man?
Dude, it
Yeah.
already is.
Yeah.
No, I'm just kidding. From what I've heard.
You don't
I know a guy.
Yeah, I read a lot of articles.
But yeah, that was kind of what I was saying. And again, I'm not saying Super Nintendo is just not as good. I freaking love Super Nintendo.
Yeah.
Because then when you start talking about different games, I mean, you got the ActRaiser series. Again, people that are talking about RPGs, you got Chrono Trigger and everything. I mean, they look,
yeah.
it's awesome, dude. The Super Nintendo is sick.
Yeah.
But NES has a lot of off titles too that are not on the Super Nintendo. Like when we talk about Shatterhand and we talk about Power Blade, you know,
Yeah.
things like that. Jackal. Oh, I know people love hearing that.
Yeah.
We always got to talk about Jackal, dude.
Scat, baby.
Yeah.
But
Talking about
Yeah.
the games we always bring up.
and don't get me wrong, man. Super Nintendo, Knights of the Round, King of Dragons, Final Fight 1, 2, and 3. I mean, don't get me wrong.
It's-
Super Nintendo is awesome.
It's dope as hell.
Yeah.
But I think to say it again, the point of this video is just to say not so fast.
Sure.
Not so fast. Don't act like it's a slam dunk.
Yeah.
That it's just the
if it was
super
sports-
superior.
Well,
If it's sports, this isn't a college team versus NFL. This is NFL versus NFL.
yeah, it's NFL
Yeah.
versus NFL.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, and they're on the same team because they're Nintendo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I am curious because I was born in '94, so obviously I missed out on the NES. I missed out on most of Super Nintendo, and so I'm curious what you guys' history is with the NES and Super Nintendo, because like a lot of people, it's when people say Super Nintendo's the best console, it's like, oh, they grew up with it, or NES is the best console, they grew up with it. I didn't. I kind of grew up with the NES, but I was a PS2 kid. What's like your history and nostalgia with the both consoles? Like, did you play both of them growing up, or?
So basically, I had a Super Nintendo and an NES. I started out with NES, obviously, and NES was primarily what I played. That's what I started out with. That's what was at the house. My brother says my dad bought the Super Nintendo, and it was at our house for like a little bit, but to me, it was always at my dad's. So every weekend or every other weekend we went over there, we went and played. My dad was obsessed with Donkey Kong Country, and Super Punch Out, you know, all them games I play. Ken Griffey Jr. Baseball. I mean, my favorite
That was a
baseball
big
game
one
of all time.
Yeah, that's a big one.
That's another one. Like when we're talking about this talk, I mean, they do have Ken Griffey Jr. Baseball.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that was
So-
dude, Ken Griffey Jr. He was a big
Badass.
deal.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I
and
mean,
that game
NES
so
had
good.
Mike Tyson. They got Ken Griffey, dude.
Yeah.
And Ken Griffey lasted a lot longer than Tyson. He went on to the 64. You know?
For sure. No, for
Yeah.
sure. So yeah, I played a lot of Super Nintendo. I didn't rent a lot of games for it, so I'm not as versed. I had a Sega Genesis at my house, so I rented more for that and had a collection of that. I actually probably played that more than Super Nintendo. The
Oh, damn.
biggest time I've had with Super Nintendo nowadays is my channel. Like
Yeah,
me going
damn.
back and playing a lot of
So
stuff.
so even as a kid, you still were an NES kid.
Dude, people laugh, but I have always had my NES stuff on me. I swear to you.
Damn.
Yeah.
So that's wild though that you even grew up with the Super Nintendo, but still picked the NES over it most of the time.
Yeah, and to be fair, that's because it was at our house.
Yeah,
right? And I
yeah.
and I had
Availability.
a pretty hefty collection.
Yeah.
Yes. So if I would have had the Super Nintendo at all times, maybe we would have rented more games for it. I remember my brother getting Super G&G. That's another game that's a 1-for-1.
Oh yeah.
Super Ghouls and Ghosts is way better than Ghosts and Goblins.
Yeah.
So that's another one where Super Nintendo clearly wins. But yeah, my brother played that, so we rented it a couple of times, but it was always at my dad's. So at my dad's, he had a pretty decent collection. He had Baseball Tonight, Foreman for Real. He had... it's kind of funny to see the games that my dad picked, you know?
Yeah.
He's got this Bugs Bunny game.
And you're just like, Dad, what are you doing?
yeah, it's funny.
What
to
are you
look back at
into?
his collection. Yeah, he had Maximum Carnage 2, Separation Anxiety,
Oh,
Death of
that's just-
Superman. Yeah.
Yeah, so
So-
he had like those are weird games to have if you have a smaller collection.
Yeah, well, he was huge into comic books, which
Oh,
I'm
okay, so
pretty
that-
sure I've told you guys. So,
that
yeah.
makes sense.
yeah.
Well, what's weird is so NES was my only console from my earliest memory. We had one,
Yeah.
so my parents got it before I was coherent. But
Which
I
is
remember
cool.
growing up, and we only had a curated small set of games, like most of us probably did. But we had no dog shit games. We had Zelda, Punch Out, Mario Duck Hunt, Excite Bike, and Gradius. Those were the core games that when I became aware, that's what we had.
That's a sick lineup.
Yeah, and then
And Wes, real quick, not to cut you off, but so you said before you were coherent you had an NES. So did your dad want to play it?
yeah, no, my dad was way
Oh.
into it, like hardcore.
That's
my
really cool.
mom
Okay.
was way into Zelda. My dad was way into Punch Out, and still to this day, my dad calls Excite Bike Excite-A-Bike.
Excited.
Still to this day, he calls it Excite-A-Bike, and
Excite-A-Bike.
he still calls the little turtles in Mario. I don't know where he got this from. He still calls them Copacayas. He's like, them fucking little Copacayas, man. And I'm like, where'd that come from? But I did not get a Super
awesome.
Nintendo, so I had neighbor friends that had one, and I always thought it was such a treat to be able to go play. Or one of my babysitters had
stuff,
one,
Yeah.
and so it was awesome.
What were like the first couple of Super Nintendo games you played? Do you
Well,
remember?
so I got Super Mario World, and
Oh, yeah.
they one of my neighbors got it at launch. They had that and Pilot Wings, but we
Pilot
we always
sucks.
played Mario, and it was so cool. And then I had a neighbor friend up the street that had Turtles in Time, Alien Wars.
Yeah, the Turtles games.
So I got to play, and I had some neighbor kids that had the Genesis and stuff too. But I did not get my Super Nintendo until I asked for an N64, and I got it in I believe it was 1997.
97.
Or how do sports games work? Because it was new and I got Madden 98, so it would have been 97.
So it would have been 97.
97.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, and Madden 98 was the newest Madden. And I got that. And the Super Nintendo set I got was the Donkey Kong Country set. So I had Donkey Kong Country.
Yeah.
I got Mario Kart and I got Super WrestleMania, which at the time I knew of Raw and Royal Rumble, but I was still pumped. I was still pumped to get it.
Yeah.
And the Super Nintendo was awesome, but you said that the NES you never left it, or you never it was never not by your side, and that takes me to this of when I moved to college, I took my PS2 and my NES and my Super Nintendo, but I took those with me to college. That was like
You took the three of them.
I had to have my NES with me though.
Damn.
Yeah. Well, I remember when I first moved into my apartment, just not to cut you off again here, but
No, you're fine.
Like, I wanted to beat Battletoads. I went back. The first time I ever tried to beat Battletoads was actually when I got my first apartment. When I was like 19.
Yeah.
Damn. That was like what, 2 years ago for you?
I wish.
Yeah. No, but it was so I had a long time of, Mormons, don't be offended, of soaking with the NES. And it's just really important. And the cool thing is we didn't have a ton of money, but being that long run, you get a lot of games either given to you or you find them just super, super cheap. And that's where I got like WrestleMania Challenge.
I mean,
and some of these other NES games that were really important.
It's kind of wild. It's kind of wild if you dive into your psyche, because that's how you still are. You're like, oh, I don't care about the new stuff. I'll get it when I get it. And then by the time you get it, you're able to get cheap games. And it's like, oh, that's because that's how it was growing up.
And I remember my WrestleMania Challenge.
Cool.
I don't know how this ever happened. It was the guy I got it from. We'll just leave it at that. But the label was ripped off. So it was just it was like paper, a paper
cartridge.
Yeah, it was just the cartridge and like had the residue, and so you put it in. It was like, dude, this is WrestleMania Challenge. So I wrote it on there.
Yeah, you wrote it down with Sharpie.
Did you ever feel like you wish you had the 64 when you got the Super Nintendo?
Dude, it was such a weird thing. I wanted the N64 so bad that Christmas. And I was not disappointed when I opened the Super Nintendo, man.
Because
I was so
sweet. Yeah.
I was so pumped, and we had a family that year. I'll never forget. We had a weird thing happen. A few days after Christmas, a drunk driver ran into our house and went into our basement in their truck, and they hit the gas line of our house, so they had to evacuate our whole city block. And I'll never forget. My cousin was staying with us, and he's like, "Dude, what do you like? I'm gonna go back in the house and get." And I was like, "Dude, you gotta get my Super Nintendo, bro." And he did. He went and got it. Yeah. And yeah, so I was obsessed with it. It wasn't like a huge letdown. I knew the fucking asking for a 64 was a Hail Mary.
Yeah.
So I got a nice safe completion with the Super Nintendo.
So you were infatuated with the Super Nintendo when you got it.
Yeah, but then the next Christmas I got a 64.
Oh, okay, so then you fell off?
I don't want to say I forgot about it, but I was really on to the N64
and then,
train.
So it seems like Dan's always been playing NES. Were you still dipping your toes into NES, or were you were like, oh, Super Nintendo 64?
Yeah.
Was there like a big turning point where you were like back to NES?
No, I always was playing it because we didn't get enough new games.
Oh, yeah.
So even when I had the N64...
Oh, and the games were like $70-$80.
Yeah, dude. We I can't even remember what all we got.
Did you ever go to Funko Land?
Yes.
You did get to go to Funko Land.
Yeah.
Man, could have cashed out there, man.
Yeah.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, no, that's and so yeah, it was always when I'd go to garage sales, I'd buy whatever I could afford, and so I was always getting new games to me, but on the older stuff. Yeah.
I mean, that's sick.
Awesome.
I was born in '94, so my mom had an NES, so that was one of the first consoles I ever played, and I dabbled with it. She had Duck Hunt and Mario Bros, and I think Top Gun, and maybe a few other things I can't quite remember. But then I didn't play Super Nintendo at all when I was a kid.
Didn't your mom have Dr. Mario?
Yeah, she had Dr. Mario in the pilot, as well.
Man, you're good. You're good as hell at that game, man.
Yeah, well, that's because it was one of the few NES games I had. But I didn't even know the Super Nintendo existed because I was born so late. And the first console that I got as a gift was the 64. So then Super Nintendo was kind of already out of the picture. None of my friends had it. So I didn't get into the Super Nintendo until we kind of started the channel.
Yeah.
And then
What, did you play Mario 64 first?
I can't remember. I think for Christmas when I got the 64, I got Mario 64, Shadows of the Empire, and Episode 1 Pod Racers.
Okay.
And I was obsessed with the Star Wars games. I played Shadows of the Empire was amazing, and then also Pod Racers was dope because I had Anakin's Pod Racer as a toy.
Sure.
So it was right next to me when I was racing. Dude, it was sick, dude.
Yeah.
I mean, I've kind of always been I gotta dress how I impress, So when I was playing baseball games on the PS2, I'd be wearing my Orioles outfit from baseball, and I'd be playing as the Orioles on MVP 05, and I do better, dude. You gotta get your head in the right space. Yeah, exactly. So that's how it's always kind of been for gaming. But so it's weird for me because I had no nostalgia for the Super Nintendo. So NES is king, but Super Nintendo is still I get why people say it's so good, and I have no nostalgia for it. So it is such a tough discussion.
Yeah.
What's up with when we were kids, and you're talking about Wes, your mom was playing it. What's up with a lot of women that played Zelda?
I don't know.
What's up with that?
I don't know.
It's a great game.
I mean, no, it's awesome. But it's like, so they've never played video games, pretty
Yeah.
much, right?
Yeah.
They go and get this NES because they gotta play Zelda. Like, what the?
I don't know.
That is a weird thing.
And the thing is I don't think my mom ever played another video game, and she knew everything about that game. Like
And that was
everything.
She just won video
She
games.
was so good at that game and knew everything about it. She had the NES book, you know, and like knew.
Okay. The Atlas.
Yeah.
That's
awesome.
That's really sick, actually.
Yeah.
That's
and
awesome.
it's weird too with my dad. My dad played more than she did. He was good at Mario and Excite-a-Bike, and
Punch Out.
Punch Out was his deal. And then once like Super Nintendo rolled around, he would dabble with us, but he just didn't give it. Once he saw there were 4 buttons on the face of the Super Nintendo, he's like, "Fuck that."
That's too many.
Yeah,
It is kind of wild because my mom obviously got the NES before I was born, and she had it. And the amount of games that she had, it's weird because she's not a gamer at all. But she had the NES. I don't even know what.
Weird.
It'd be fun to ask her like why she got it or something. But yeah, the games that she had, it was just like Mario, Dr. Mario, and then I think she liked Tom Cruise, so the Top Gun, you know.
Yeah.
And
Tom
it's
Cruise,
just like
all right, not Tom Cruise, but Top Gun was popular though.
yeah,
Yeah.
but like
Yeah.
it was like that's. But she's not a gamer, and like she,
Sure.
I think she got a Wii for Christmas one year, but that was for like Rock Band and
Bowling.
shit. Like it's for bowling. It wasn't like she's never been a gamer, so it is weird that there's that generation of people that bought the NES and played it and then never touched video games again.
for sure. And my good friend Ryan, Dan, you know Ryan, he's been on the channel before.
Yeah.
He was back, I don't know, 6-7 months ago, and his mom came over to my place, and she like came down to the game room and was like, "Holy shit!" And she's like, "Do you have Dr. Mario?" And I put it in, and she just went hammer time.
Yeah,
on
she
it.
sat on the floor right next to the TV and was
Yeah.
just like into it, and I was like, "What the?"
And
fuck?
she's like really good at it, but she's not a gamer.
Yeah,
but the NES
Wow.
was a thing.
It's just weird. It's but we turned out into these nerds.
Yeah.
It's just there's people our age, but then there's this. I just had a talk with another streamer the other day, and I was in a stream, and he's like 10 years older than us, and I was asking him like, it's like the differences in their memories with it are so different than ours, man.
Yeah.
And so I wonder when you go even further to like our parents, like what was the talk like to have you go need to play Zelda?
Yeah.
Are
Like,
they at
what was
work
it?
like, you ever play Zelda? What's that? You know?
Yeah.
Like, it's so weird. It's
It's
just so
fascinating.
weird.
It is so
Yeah.
weird because now when I'm at work, everybody's talking about video games, and it's like, oh,
Sure.
have you played Breath of the Wild, or have you played Tears,
Yeah.
or have you played the new Call of Duty, or have you played? And it's like everybody's.
It's a lot more normal.
It's so normal, but like back
Yeah.
in the day, can you imagine like you got an NES? Like,
Yeah.
Well, and
Damn.
another thing was back then, that wasn't like it was a cheap investment either.
No.
That's like you're going out and spend a couple $100, which back then, I mean, that's a lot more than it is now.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Wasn't it like 180 when it was like on sale in those books and everything?
Yeah.
with Sears?
Yep.
Maybe brand new. What was it brand new?
I think when it first came out, I think it was $2. I think.
Damn,
Okay.
200.
Okay.
But back in
That's
85, 86, that's a lot of money, you know.
Yeah, you pretty much double it. Yeah, 2.5 or so. Yeah.
So 400,
Yeah,
500
it's
bucks.
wild.
But-
Something that we were talking about, not to switch subject, here,
No.
but I did before we got too far. You brought up Turtles games
Yes.
with Super Nintendo and NES. So that's another good one. You have Turtles in Time because you have Tournament Fighters that's on both, but Tournament Fighters overall everybody doesn't. It's kind
Yeah.
of poor.
Just ignore it.
So you got Turtles in Time, which is freaking awesome.
It's
right?
one of the best
Like,
turtles, yeah.
But you got Ninja Turtles 1, which is like some people hate it, but then there's like a cult following behind it. I think the more time goes on, people kind of like it. But then there's Turtles 2 and Turtles 3 Manhattan projects, and Turtles 2 is the arcade game.
Yeah.
Do you go with all three of those or just Turtles in Time?
That's so tough because Turtles in Time is one of the best Turtles games. But then going back, you have more of them.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's like that is tough. You were bringing up before we recorded too, going back to like this comparison and stuff. Ninja Gaiden.
Yep, Ninja Gaiden 1, 2, and 3, and then on the Super Nintendo, you did have the remake or whatever you want to call it. It's called Trilogy.
Yeah.
But really, that's just the NES games.
Yeah.
So
It
it's
is,
like
just a different polish.
So if you're going to give credit to anybody, just remember NES had Ninja Gaiden 1, 2, and 3.
Mhm.
Well, why didn't they have a Ninja Gaiden on the Super Nintendo?
That's a great question.
That
I
is
don't
weird
know.
because it was such a big. It was so big and everybody
It would've
loved it.
It would have been freaking awesome.
Yeah. Super Ninja Gaiden. Man, that would have been.
Yeah.
A Super Ninja. that'd have been sick. But going back to the discussion of NES versus Super Nintendo, it's so tough because you can go down one way and be like, oh, Super Nintendo's better, but then when you go down another path, you're like, well, then the NES is better. Like, I think they're both 1A. Like, they're both.
Yeah, exactly.
They're both so good.
Yeah, most of the time you end up at a crossroads of, do I take the best game in the series or three really good games in the series? Like what and that's not all, but most of the time that's what you get at.
And there are some staples like that are on the Super Nintendo that it's like, well, those games are big, heavy things, so then it outweighs some of the NES. But
Donkey Kong.
Donkey Kong Country for sure, dude. Mm-hmm. But man, it's so tough, and it also depends on what type of games you like. If you're like, you mentioned RPGs earlier. It's like, if you're into RPGs, the Super Nintendo will dominate, probably.
And I think there's no right or wrong answer. That's what's fun talking about this.
Yeah,
they're both amazing, but in the defense of the NES, slow down.
Yeah, I think it's still up there, guys.
Yeah,
you can still say that Super Nintendo is like maybe the best console of all time, but maybe just be like, oh, NES is there.
But it's not a blow.
It's just missing the S, dude. That's all it's missing.
It's not a blowout. We have a tight game to the fourth quarter.
Yeah,
no, they're winning by a field goal.
Yeah.
And it's good.
Yeah,
they got it.
Good stuff.
Sure.
Well, always love getting this group together. Love chatting with you, Dan. Good times. Toast to the NES and to the SNES.
Yeah.
I mean,
yes,
they're both fantastic, but don't sleep on the NES, guys. There is a lot there, and hope you enjoyed this follow up. Thanks again, Dan, for being on the channel. We'll catch you guys on the next episode of the one and only Gaming Off the Grid.